The problem is that that idea doesn't sustain. If you have a very complex or a high density graphics, because to sustain high density graphics you will need more complex hardwares, right? So that's what happened, that the earlier simple video graphics arrays, they evolved to this kind of complex hardwares. But the issue with these complex hardwares is that they are very much application specific. Like, well, these are the following graphics engines which were popularly used, like OpenGL and DirectX, right? These are the graphics engines that are popularly used worldwide for, driving the computer graphics. But they are also dependent on such fixed function pipelines which are there in the hardware. So what GPUs came as initially was that they came as a replacement of this kind of pipelines, because this, instead of being fixed function, GPUs offered programmability. So this is the kind of high level block diagram of a standard processor, right? And this is how, these are all mostly taken from Hennessy Patterson's book. So this is kind of a high level block block view of a graphics processing unit. We'll slowly go through this and see that how the graphics processing unit organizes the internal processing units, and how what actually happens to that. I am sure you must have gone through the video anyway. So just before that, what we offered was a basic introduction to classic RISC pipeline. So as we know that in a computer, there are two basic ways of computer architecture design: reduced instruction set computing and complex instruction set computing. Though in complex instruction set computing, the idea is that, well, you may have a significant number of instructions, and you may also have you may have specialized instructions for doing very special activities. Let's say multiply, add together, or multiply or fuse, multiply, add together, or let's say some complex functionality, let's say adding and working on operands which are directly in the memory. Several such things are possible. So what would happen is you would have an instruction set where you have lot of instructions, and some instructions are regular instructions and some are for very special purpose. The other alternative approach is that, well, we have a instruction set which is very simple. Every complex functionality can be implemented by a sequence of the simple instructions, but each of the complex simple instructions are executing very fast. So that is the way people came up with RISC architectures. And we also listed this comparison of features. I will not go through them again. I think they're in the video. So what I'm trying to do here is, as you can see, I'm summarizing the slide. You may be having doubts at certain points. So wherever you are having the doubts, please stop me and we will discuss. Fine, because I'm just summarizing here. And the next thing that came in was an example of a CPU data path. So you can see through that what are the different stages in the pipeline and what are the components there through which the data path gets activated. And we said that, well, this is not a pipeline data path. And if it's not a pipeline data path, that means for executing different functionalities, you have variable delays here. Now, if you are trying to set a clock for this data path, you have to account for the maximum possible delay. So, yes.
Sir, sorry to interrupt. Can you go back to the differences part? Yes,
Yes.
this slide. Here you have written that CIS feature. One of them is micro code support. What does that mean?
Yeah. So microcode essentially means that this is a concept called microprogrammed control, which used to be there. So the idea is that, well, you execute a complex program, a complex instruction. Now that instruction that will go to a ROM, okay, and it will fetch, corresponding to the instruction, a sequence of simpler instructions known as microcodes, and they will finally execute. So in CISC processors, that thing is there. So in that way to speak, every CISC processor has got a layered architecture. At the top, you have CISC complex instructions, but at the lower level, you have such, simple instructions or microcodes.
Okay, sir. And what is the meaning of this addressing modes?
Okay, so you are from what background?
Sir, mathematics second year.
Okay, okay. So addressing mode would mean, let's say you have this instruction, okay? Multiply content of two locations. So these are addresses, memory addresses, okay?
Yes, sir.
And okay, let me write an, you can see my screen, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, 1 minute. So let me copy this instruction here. So this essentially means, suppose I have a memory, okay, and so let's say here somewhere I have a memory, okay, and in this memory, let's say here I have address 1, here I have address 2, here I have address 3, things like that, and in these addresses I have some values, right? Let's say here I have value 10 in address 1, here I have value 20 in address 2, like that, okay, okay, and let's say somewhere I have some address 3, okay. So that's how it is. Now, if I give this instruction, it means that, well, I get to these individual addresses, get those values, do the multiplication and store the value in address 3, right? So the so this is a standard CISC instruction. Have you understood this thing, that how this is equivalent to this RISC instruction?
Yes, sir.
Fine. So my point is, in both cases, you see that there is a concept that there is an instruction which may often involve addresses, right? I mean, your whole point here is that you want to get some data from some address, right? So typically what happens is, you will have to compute an address and get the data from the address. So for that purpose, different styles of computing exist, and each of these are known as addressing modes. Give me some 1 minute. I will open a slide on this which I have already prepared. 1 minute. Yeah. So these are typically the addressing modes that are supported in computer architecture. One is called register addressing mode. Register addressing mode would mean you get the data in register, and so essentially, let's say this: you have you are having an add instruction. You are adding the content of register T0 and T1 and storing the result in T2. Okay. So this will be known as direct addressing, because in this case, what the instruction would encode is that a register's code. So suppose you have 32 registers, okay? So how do I indicate that? Well, I am pointing to register T0. I am pointing to register T1. So I need to have a binary pattern which would tell me. So, and I would need 5 bits to encode and say what register I am talking about. So then when I write the binary code for this, add will have an opcode, and each of these T0, T1, T2, for them I would have a 5 binary bits for each of them, which will say that which register I am mentioning to. Fine. So this is called direct addressing, because I am directly referring to a register through a binary encoding. Fine. The next thing is known as, so that's one way to get data and compute with the data, by referring to the register. Okay. What we do is we just refer to the register through an encoding. The next would be this kind of displacement mode of addresses, or indirect addressing. For example, let's say you are trying to load word. Okay. Load word is an instruction through which you can access a memory address and load the content of it to some register RD. This is just one register, destination register. We are calling it RD. So see how we have written it. Load word, register name, then this is an index. This will be a constant value followed by another register's name. Now, how does this help? So what we are saying is, this is called the base register, which have some address. So you add this address with this constant to calculate that effective address, you go to that effective address in the memory, get the data, and get it right here to the content of RT. Am I clear what I am saying?
Yes, sir.
Now this base register need not be any base register if it becomes the program counter itself. Program counter means program counter means there is a special register called program counter which is holding the address of the program line that I am executing. Okay. So every microprocessor will have a program counter and it is storing right now which locations instruction I am executing. Fine. So if this is the program counter register, then this is known as PC relative addressing. So then let us say I am saying that, well, you go to I further steps from the program counter and see what is the address. From that address, whatever you get, you load it in RT. Okay. So this is displacement or PC relative addressing, and there's an indirect addressing. And there is another thing called immediate addressing. Immediate addressing means you don't go to the memory, you are provided with a value, you work with that value itself. For example, add immediate. Add immediate with the content of register T1 with the value 1 that I am immediately giving you. So you don't have to fetch this value by looking into a register or calculating the address to a base and offset, those things. Okay. So in that way, what we mean is addressing mode means the typical different ways through which you can get access of data in a microprocessor. So for that, you can get the data directly. You can get the data indirectly by doing some address calculation using a base and offset, or you can get the data directly inside another register. So this is also a way of direct addressing. This is direct addressing. This is indirect addressing because you have to calculate the address, and this is immediate addressing. And PC relative addressing, as you can understand, is one form of indirect addressing. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So then came the CPU data path, and as you may have gone through this. So in the CPU data path, when you implement it, there are different functions that it can do. But the issue is, depending on what operation you are doing, sometimes the CPU data path may take 5 cycles, sometimes 2 cycles, sometimes 3 cycles, like that. So how do I clock this data path? So to have to clock this data path, I have to give a clock whose width is at least greater than the maximum delay that can occur, right? So that will make the data path very slow. The other option is, well, I divide the data path into different stages known as pipeline stages, which are going to take some fixed amount of time. Now what will happen? I will clock each pipeline and connect them one to another. So then what happens? Each of the pipeline stages will be very fast, right? And so I can have a earlier, why did some operation take more time, less time, like that? Because those operations did not use all the different stages. Some of them may use all the stages, like that. So now what will happen? Whichever operation has to take 3 cycles will complete in 3 cycles. Whichever will take 5 cycles will complete the 5 cycles, like that. But in the way, overall I will get a speed up here, because in general, I mean, each of the stages are becoming fast, and I am not limited by the maximum delay that can occur in the data path. Was this thing clear to everybody?
Yes, sir.
If you have any doubt, you just hold me there, okay? Then we'll proceed accordingly. I'm just skimming through because these are already in my recorded video. Maybe I have explained there with more time and all that, but still I am asking because you may have issues. Okay. So overall, as you can understand, the idea is, if I have a non-pipeline design, then always that data path will work, assuming that, well, whatever is executing will take the maximum time. But if I do a pipeline design, then it will act based on what is the operation. If there is a fast operation which will not take all the stages, it will finish quickly, otherwise it will finish fast, like that, right? So that is how we arrive at from single cycle instructions to multi-cycle instructions, which are executed in this kind of pipeline data paths, right? So that is the idea of pipelining. And then what happened? Well, when we did pipelines, then came the question of structural hazard, which means that, well,
excuse me, sir.
Yes. Yes.
Sir, in that 5-stage pipeline, can you explain that 4th one again, that memory? Yeah, that one.
Okay. Good. So anybody who wants to explain? Anybody who understood this? Fine.
Can I try?
Yes, sure.
First,
Who is
should I
this?
tell Sayoni?
Okay, please.
First, we need to fetch the instruction from memory.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, the decode phase will make us understand that what is the operation we need to perform and what are the addresses from which we need to fetch the data. Maybe from register the data will be fetched, and then in the ALU unit we will execute those operations that need to be performed on the data. And memory stage is for then again, if we need to interact with memory from CPU to memory interaction, for that we need that memory stage. Maybe some resulting data that is calculated from ALU that need to be placed back to some memory address. For that we need this memory stage, and then write back stage is for register interaction. Like we need some data for next instruction to be present in the register. So for that register writing, we need the write back stage.
Okay, good. So just to summarize, see, you are executing a various kinds of instructions through this pipeline, right? And every instruction is passing through all these stages. Now, primarily, see, we have two kinds of instructions. Let's say the arithmetic instructions. So you have an instruction. For example, you take this instruction. Okay, let me change it to a register type instruction. So primarily, we will always deal with RISC style computing, and in RISC style computing, what happens? This earlier thing will never happen, right? Because in RISC computing, no arithmetic operation will work on the memory. All arithmetic operations to that way, all operations, arithmetic or logical, they always operate on registers. And for doing that, you have to load data to the registers and store the results back to the memory from the registers, right? So that is why we call a RISC architecture as a load star architecture. So this is a typical RISC instruction. If we have to replace this, so let's say I have a sorry, that was a RISC instruction, and I am replace it with a RISC instruction. So suppose you are executing this RISC instruction there. Now when you execute the RISC instruction, so you are multiplying R0 and R1 and storing the result in R2, right? So where will what happen? So the meaning of the multiply instruction will be understood by the microprocessor in the decode stage. Then the multiplication of R0 and R1 will happen in the execute stage, right? So this does all the calculations. What kind of calculations you may require? Well, this is an arithmetic calculation that I did, so that will use the multiplier block. You may require a logical operation, for example, evaluating some condition, comparing two values, and you may also require to calculate memory addresses or branch conditions. For example, you are trying to have execute an instruction, let's say, which will have a PC relative addressing. So you have to calculate the memory address, right? Based on, you have to add the base register with the offset. So who will do that? That will also be done by this. Branch condition, suppose you have an instruction that, well, you branch if A is greater than B, right? Or then in which location you will go, that address also needs to be calculated, and for that the branch condition needs to be evaluated. So who will do that? Again, this ALU will do that, right, in the execute stage. So you evaluate the multiplication here, but then you have something to do, right? You have after doing the multiplication, you have to store that result back in the R2. So this write back to R2 will not happen in the next stage, it will happen in the write back stage. So that would means this output is still there at the output of the execution unit. Then with one clock cycle, the mem stage will pass, and after that in this clock cycle, you will get the write back. The question is then, why do we have the mem stage? Well, it is useful for something else, which is operating the load storage instructions. For example, let's say you have an instruction, load data to R1, and from where, let's say I R2. So what we mean is, this is an offset, let's say 100 R2. R2 contains an address, you add with 100 and you get that effective address. From that address, let's say your R2 content is 0xFF. So I'm writing a address in hexadecimal, which is typically done in every place, right? So that would mean you have to first calculate this address, right? You have to add 100 with 0xFF, though this is in base 10 I'm writing, right? And this is in base 16, right? So you have to do this calculation. Who will do? That calculation will be done by the mem unit. And then, sorry, that calculation will be done by the ex unit. And then from this address, you are supposed to bring that data, right? Well, who will bring that data? That is the job of the mem unit, right? It will bring that data. And then that data will be returned back to this R1 register in the write back state. So every kind of update to the register files happen in the write back stage. Getting the data from the memory or writing the data back to the memory, that is specifically I mean things that you have to do for load store instruction, those will happen in the memory stage. So that is why these two stages get divided here. Fine?
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you.
So I think we understood a bit of pipeline, and after pipeline comes the issue of hazards. Now, so do you have any question on the hazard part? I think some of these things are explained with examples here. So if you have any question, you tell me which slide and what to ask. I mean, which part you want to understand, or otherwise we'll just browse through this thing. So first type of hazard is structural hazard. Now let's understand one thing. Since I have a pipeline design, that means instructions keep on flowing into the pipeline one after another, right? Now suppose I have a sequence of 4 load word instructions. So what will happen? The first instruction is fetching data from memory. That means it is in the mem stage, right? So then the 4th instruction is getting fetched from the memory. It is in the fetch stage, right? So fetch, decode, execute, and memory. That are the stages, right? So when the first instruction is here, the 4th instruction is already here in the memory stage. Now that would mean this is I mean, the 4th instruction cannot really proceed as long as that memory operation doesn't get complete, right? Now let's understand why this will occur. Was this understood by people? Why this is the problem?
Yes, sir.
Tell me what is the problem?
Sir, the instruction fetch and the memories both use the memory bank. So if multiple access is not allowed, then only one will be able to take place.
Why will multiple accesses happen?
Sir, because the ith instruction will be in the mem stage, whereas the I plus 4th instruction will be in the instruction fetch stage. So both will be trying to access a memory. One will be trying to access the instruction from the memory, and one will be trying to access the data from memory.
So I think the previous
yes.
instruction has to first write it, right? Access the memory, and only after that the next instruction can do something with it. So
Yeah.
Unless the first instruction is done with it, the next instruction cannot, because it will give wrong result if it tries to.
Yes. So it is something like this. So let's say, so these are the positions of your instructions, right? I mean, you have 4 instructions. So we are just, I mean, trying to recreate that scenario here, right? So this is the 4th instruction. Sorry, this is the first instruction. As we said, the situation is first instruction is here, second instruction is here, third instruction is here, and the 4th instruction is here. So this is what we said, right? Now observe that all are load instructions. So all the instructions are basically like this, right? Now that would mean the 4th instruction is right now being fetched. Third instruction, sorry, this is decode, right? So third instructions, meaning the processor is understanding. The processor has already understood the meaning of second instruction, and it is in this stage, though it has got nothing to do in the stage apart from the address calculation. So maybe if it is in this kind of a address calculation is required, it is doing that. If instead of this directly an address is given in the register, let's say only R2 is given, then it has got nothing to do, it is just sitting there. But anyway, all of them has to come through this sequence, right? My point is clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
But the thing is, this is all connected in a fast clock, right? Because the idea is we are doing a single cycle to multi-cycle implementation. It's a pipeline. So the assumption is every pipeline stage will take one clock cycle, and that is why the overall maximum time an instruction can take is for five clock cycles, because there are five pipeline stages, right? But the issue is this instruction is now in the memory stage and it has made the memory request. So the memory is now doing what? Memory is right now interfacing with the DRAM block here, right? So the memory is trying to bring the data from this thing. Now this access is very slow, whereas this clock for the pipeline is very fast. Got it? Now since this access is very slow, this instruction will not be leaving this block as long as it doesn't get the data. So and that can take tens or 20 of cycles. Okay. So as long as it doesn't get this data, it doesn't leave this block, and as long as it doesn't leave this block, everybody is stalled. That means they are all waiting. So there are intermediate registers known as this kind of what they call as pipeline registers, and so those values will be here like this, right? And everybody is stalled. The pipeline is stalled because this has not finished. So this is the structural hazard. Why? It's a structural hazard because the microprocessor doesn't have sufficient number of extra elements in its structure to cater for multiple memory accesses in parallel. It can do access only from this stage, and since this is being stalled, so everybody is stalled because this is quite slow doing the memory access. Had it been the case, just to understand why this is called a structural hazard, to alleviate this hazard, whatever I have to do is something which is like redesigning the microprocessor structure. Because in that case, whatever I have to do is I have to modify the structure. Maybe I will bring in extra memory units so that from here I can issue multiple instructions to multiple memory units. And not only that, I also have to modify this structure, because let's say this is a single port memory. That means I can only read one data point at a time. Okay. But if I make it different, if I make it a multi-port memory, that means this memory had got multiple read-write ports, and that would mean I can issue two memory requests, get the data from the memory in two parallel reads. Okay. So the way we are solving this is we are modifying the design of the system. We are modifying the structure of the system. That is why fundamentally this is a structural hazard here. Got it?
Sir, is this thing the same as banking in GPU that you are talking in the videos?
Those things will come later on when we go to GPUs. First, let's. Okay. Is structural hazard clear for now?
The structural hazard is being caused because is it because of the modifying of the structure, or is it because two instructions are trying to access the memory at the same time?
I am telling, the reason is two instructions are not, they are not trying to access the memory address at the same time, right? One cannot access because the other is already accessing. Because one is already in the memory stage, so the other cannot progress. Got the point?
Okay.
Okay. So fine. Then so that's about the structural hazard. So that's it. It is happening. The pipeline is stalling due to lack of resources. The hardware cannot support the multiple reads in parallel. So if I have to alleviate this hazard, so this is one hazard. Now the issue is if I have to alleviate this hazard, I have to play with the structure of the system. So that is one fundamental reason why we call it a structural hazard. I think data hazard is clear from this example. Or if you have not understood this example, tell me, we will explain this. Hello.
It's clear, sir.
Okay. Control hazard.
Yes, sir, it's clear.
Anybody can explain this?
Sir, can I try?
Sure, sure.
So because whenever a branch condition exists, the next instructions, like there are two paths that the program can, two sets of instructions that the program can execute. So if it waits for the branch condition to satisfy, at that moment it can preemptively try to execute a set of instructions which it predicts based on previous occurrences. But in case that prediction turns out to be false, then the pipeline stage needs to be flushed because those instructions are wrong and the other sets of instruction needs to be executed. So this is called control hazards, I think.
Right, right. Okay.
Sir, how does this
Yes.
flushing operation take place in the so how do you flush the values which are already calculated or already loaded?
Okay, so what you really have is between each pipeline stage, you have this kind of what they call as memory elements. Okay, okay. Let me remove this fictitious memory because it is really not there. Okay, so these are called pipeline registers. So output of fetch goes here. In the next clock cycle, whatever is the content goes here like this, right? Now, whenever the pipeline stalls, it stalls means what? These registers, this transfer will not happen. The next stage is not activated. Now, flushing simply means you reset these registers, because every digital system works based on memory elements. If you erase the memory, that means it will just forget that instruction state, because every instruction going through the pipeline means it is updating its state. The register contents are changing, so you just flush that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Now the next thing which was important is memory hierarchy. So I believe we discussed about the principle of locality and what are the different possible cache mappings that happen. For example, and what are the different cache write policies, right? I mean, it can either be a write through or a write back policy, and how the caches are organized. And for the cache maps, I mean, you have three possibilities: fully associative, directly, I mean set associative, and direct map caches. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of that? And what is also a cache replacement policy? Like typically we use the LRU policy, which is that you keep a count that which is the recently, I mean least recently used data block, and you replace it. So if you have any issue with the cache part, please tell me.
So I have a thing. So in the memory system where you mentioned that the bus transmission is fast and the memory rate that is slow.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that? Why? Yeah, this guy.
Okay.
And how is this whole system designed? Like, how is it reading a single bus is reading from multiple uh, locations and without increasing the bus width? So how does this take place, and how is this operation fast?
Okay, 1 minute. So let us consider that you have two different memory segments, DRAM 0 and DRAM 1, right? Now, first of all, why will you really consider that? Because as we said, reading and writing the memory chips are slow, because as we have seen that memory technology grows very slowly, whereas the processor frequency has grown much faster, right? So read and write from the memory is considered as slow, but whereas this on-chip interconnect, which will connect the DRAMs to the main the main processor, that's the CPU, that is a fast connection. Okay. Now, what do I really want to do? When I am making a data request from the processor to the memory, I want that this, I mean the slowness of the DRAM, that is the latency, I have to hide that. Now let's understand what do I really mean by hiding. So suppose when I am executing instructions, let's say I have a load instruction, okay, and then I have an add instruction, okay, and then I again have a load instruction, like this, right? Now suppose I have fired this load instruction. Since the DRAM is very slow, it is taking time, so my add cannot progress. Is this understood? Hello?
Yes, sir.
So
Yes, sir.
what is the optimization that I can do? Well, if this add and the subsequent load doesn't have any dependency, one thing I can do is put them one by one in parallel and then have the add. So you issue load instruction 1, load instruction 2, and then the add. Why will I do this? I am assuming that right now these two load instructions are going to consecutive addresses. Now for most practical purpose, DRAMs are banked. If you see a DRAM chip, you will see multiple ICs sitting on that. Have you ever seen a DRAM chip? You will see that multiple ICs are there. So those are the memory banks. Now how is the data arranged in the memory? So this is bank 1, this is bank 2. So actually I should write DRAM bank 0. Okay, this is DRAM bank 1. So that would really mean, let's say address 0 is here, address 1 is here, address 2 is here, address 3 is here, address 4 is here, address 5 is here. The mapping is like this. Got it? So if you have 32 banks, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you are doing consecutive memory location address, the high chances you are going to different banks. So suppose your loads are to consecutive or not the same bank. So that will, what will happen? You are then issuing the load command to different banks. They can transfer the data in parallel and you can access it, right? What is the good thing? Then the add can go ahead and the latency of each of the loads, suppose the loads for each of the loads are going to take 100 CPU cycles. Then two loads are going to take 200 CPU cycles, but that is not happening because you are issuing parallel requests. The next question that comes, how do you get the data from here to the through a bus to the CPU? There are two options. I can have two buses. Well, I will never have that. What people do is people have a wide bus. Wide bus means, so suppose there are the interface here is 32 and 32 bit here. That means from memory I can read words which are of length 32 bit here and also word length 32 bit here. If I have a 64 bit wide bus, then I can do a parallel read from here and here 32 bit, and at the end where the read is done in the CPU, I gather those 32, that entire 64 bit, interpret the first 32 bit as the memory address from the DRAM bank 0, and interpret the next 32 bit as the memory from the memory address from DRAM bank 1, right? The other option is, well, I don't really do that. I have a single 32 bit wide bus, but still I am okay. Why? Because as we are saying, this bus communication is very much more faster than the DRAM read and write. So through the bus, some signal will come. Accordingly, the reads will start. The reads are anyway slow. So when the reads are done, the reads are being stored. The values that have been read will be stored here in a buffer. And from those two buffers, I can just sequentially transfer in using a 32 bit wide. Since the transfer is fast, it is not creating any latency. It's the reading from the DRAM which is creating the latency. Is that clear?
Sure, sir. The buffer thing was the missing in the explanation. Oh, well,
right.
in those videos, yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to ILP. ILP means, well, as we have already discussed about the different kinds of hazards that can happen, right? The read after write, write after write, and so First of all, we have discussed that, I mean, here we have already covered the hazards, right? A structural hazard, data hazard, and a control hazard. Now we know that, well, for hazards, there will be several classes of data hazards. For example, whether you are trying to read before the write has been completed, or whether you are trying to write a variable before the previous write has been completed, and all that. And the CPU has to work in such a way that these hazards get detected, and accordingly the execution will progress. We have already given you some examples in the slide of certain hazards, and as we have said, the CPU must work in such a way that it can detect such hazards and accordingly stall the pipeline execution so that the system doesn't do something wrong. So when you are actually calculating the cycles per instruction executed by the pipeline, you have to consider the ideal CPI, which is 1, and add the different stalls that will come due to structural hazard, control hazard, and data hazard, right? Now, so this in general is going to disturb what we call the instruction level parallelism that we have, right? So there are several interesting techniques that people have figured out for increasing the parallelism of executing instructions, that's or ILP. And we have given some examples here, right? Like how if you unroll a loop, then as you can see that every loop execution has got an overhead. Overhead means I have to calculate the branch address, then I have to decide whether to jump or not based on this loop overhead condition. I have to actually evaluate the loop overhead condition, that whether this is happening or not. So for that, we have already given you the assembly program here. Now, what will happen if I execute a normal loop? Every iteration of the loop will also mean I have to execute the loop overhead. But if I unroll the loop, then what happens? The number of times I have to execute the loop overhead instructions is decreasing, right? But does that mean that I will unroll the entire loop? What do you think?
No.
Why?
Because the code size will increase then.
Yeah, so like we have said, well, what is the advantage of a loop? The advantage of a loop is, computer programming is all about nice loops, right? You give a function and you say that, well, you repeat and repeat and repeat this function. So my specification is this much, but with this I can make a computer busy for 1,000 hours, right? I have to just control the value of I here, right? So that's the advantage of loop. Now, if I unroll, then I definitely lose out on the entire advantage, because then for doing a simple functionality, I have to have so much of assembly. These are unrolling of four levels of unrolling, as you can see here, right? But for that, well, I am decreasing the overhead, but the code size increases. What is the problem with code size increase? If the code size is increasing, I have to actually make more use of extra registers here, right? If I increase the mode number, because there are a lot of live variables here, variables which are still relevant in the loop. So for that, I am using more number of registers for the simple program, and that increases what we call as register pressure. Register pressure means whenever a program is executing, how many typically on the average registers are live in the program. So I'm using more code, I'm writing more code here. The assembly code size is big. If the code size is big, then in the instruction cache, from where I am bringing the instructions, I will have more misses because I am bringing in more instructions. The cache is being filled up with unnecessarily the same kind of instruction again and again, right? And I am making use of more number of registers, which is also increasing the register pressure. To understand what is register pressure, let's understand that if you have a program which is using too many registers, then suppose there is a new variable which is to store, right? For that, it will not find a register which is empty. And what will the computer do if it doesn't find a register to hold that variable? Well, it has to then store it back to through the cache to the memory, right? And that is going to take much more time, because accessing register is the fastest. If you are unable to put a value into a register, then you have to track back to the memory, and that will increase your access time and decrease the program execution speed and all that. So that is why register pressure is an important thing. Well, the next thing was branch prediction. So is this understood at least at a higher level? We need not go at a, this is not a computer architecture course. We're just trying to give an understanding that how branch prediction is really happening inside a computer. So anybody has a question on this?
No, sir. I had a question in about MIPS.
Yes.
Like, what is the do we need to what is the expected knowledge of MIPS that we are supposed to have for the further course? Like,
Okay. I mean, if you understand this slide completely, it's fine.
okay.
That is why I'm saying if you have any doubt about this slide, any point, even if you are not saying it right now, maybe you have not looked through properly or whatever, you keep on posting your queries in that student discussion channel we have, which is there right for these reasons. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So anybody has any issue with the branch prediction?
Sir, can you briefly just explain the hierarchical prediction? Could not understand that part.
Okay. You understood a simple branch predictor, weakly taken, strongly not taken, that part?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, see, this is more like a, we would say, generalization of branch prediction. So, what do I do in a simple predictor? Simple predictor does it as simple as, well, if the last decision, suppose I'm executing a code and it's executing in a loop or something. So, and the last branch decision I faced, I predicted that yes, you take the decision. Yes, you take it. Okay. Now, if I have gone wrong, then I am talking about a, 1-bit branch predictor. This is a picture of a 2-bit branch predictor. 1 bit means what? I will repeat whatever I did earlier. So suppose last time the actual decision was to take the branch. So this time I will predict that, well, I will take the branch. I will take the branch, but if I see eventually I will see that whether I have to really take the branch or not, right? So eventually I see that, well, my decision is wrong. Then I will roll back and I set the bit to something which will say that, well, the last decision is not taking the branch. So the next time again when I predict, I will say that I don't take the branch. So that is a simple 1-bit branch predictor. Is that clear with everybody? What is fundamentally branch prediction? It's all about predicting the branch, whether I have to take the branch or not take the branch, based on, just a hunch, without calculating the branch condition. If we just explain. So let's say I have a condition. If A greater than B plus C. So see, if A greater than B plus C, then you are going to do something, right? And otherwise, you are going to completely do something different. Please mute your microphone. Somebody is creating noise there. So you see, when this is a classic branch situation, right? Because here there's what will be the assembly corresponding to this? You will have branch if not equal to some condition, blah blah blah, right? Now the thing is, you have to evaluate this condition. That is going to take time. So what a branch predictor does is it will just give you a decision that, well, you go inside the branch or you go inside the else, right? Now, the 1-bit branch predictor simply means it will remember its previous decision, whether it was correct. Suppose the decision was to take the branch and it found that not taking the branch is the correct decision. So it will simply say that, well, not take the branch. So you just continue the execution as is and like that, right? So that's a 1-bit branch predictor. Similar like a 2-bit branch predictor, stuff like that. Now hierarchical prediction would mean you generalize this concept. So you have an m-length history of branches. That suppose I remember that I took a branch, then I didn't take the branch, then I again took the branch, then I again took the branch. Suppose I have a history. And for that history, I have an n-bit predictor. So let's understand this concept. So what I just said earlier was an 1-bit predictor, right? 1-bit predictor means you have a finite machine which is deciding between taken and not taken just based on the previous history. Whether last time I took, well, then last time did I take, and whether was I correct? Well, if I was correct, then this time also I will take. Now 2-bit branch predictor would mean I will decide my current value based on my 2-bit history. For example, if you see here, suppose right now my state is strongly taken. Strongly taken means, well, I will again say that, well, you take the branch. So I take the branch. Now, if I take the branch and eventually I see that this is a correct decision, then I will stay here only. Are you with me? Anybody? No?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Now suppose I am again taking the branch, but I see that eventually my decision is wrong. That means from strongly taken, I will come to a weakly taken state. Had it been a one bit branch predictor, what would have happened? These states would not be there. So from taken, I will go to a not taken state. But since this is a 2-bit predictor, that means I have 4 states. So is this clear? What is the difference between a 1-bit and 2-bit predictor?
Yes, sir.
Now just assume that I am going to use this 2-bit predictor if my current branch history matches with an m-length string. I will use another 2-bit predictor if my current branch history matches with another m-length string. Here there is no history. Here I am just checking for the last the last thing, right? My point is so there are 2 things here, right? The branch predictor will take a decision based on its branch history here, and what kind of automaton I will follow, that is dictated by the length of my branch history. Okay, so what we are saying is we can have m possible branch histories, right? And for each of the possible histories, you say that, well, I will use an n-bit predictor. So this is the general idea of m comma n prediction. Anyway, this is not part of our syllabus here, but I'm just keeping it for your idea. So let's understand what this means. It simply means instead of having one such finite automata, I can have multiple such finite automatons, and which automata I select to use depends on what is my current m-bit branch history. Am I clear?
Yes, sir. So like this will the 2-bit branch predictor will be like 1,2 hierarchical prediction.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so next we had some examples like optimizations. Like for example, one classical optimization is how you can replace registers with some new registers so that certain hazards move out. And we gave a nice example on that. Was this okay?
Yes, sir. So, but this basically means that we are using another register. So, for example,
Yes. If you have extra registers, you modify in the program in the runtime with those registers, and that helps you to remove the hazards and execute fast.
or sir, if we were coding, like we could also remove the hazards while you were coding, but in this case, the compiler removes them.
Yeah. Because you are not coding at the assembly level, right? You are coding at a higher level. So
yes, sir.
whatever will happen here will be done by the compiler itself.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's about the basics we wanted you to discuss, and then comes the next slide, which is on how, yes?
Sir, can you explain the difference between VLIW and statistically scheduled superscalars in terms of their compiler function? What compiler is doing differently in both of them?
Yes, can you say again? VLIW
and statistically scheduled superscalar in terms of what compiler is doing differently in both of them?
Okay, so if you see VLIW, in VLIW, what you are saying is there are certain pipelines, right? What the compiler is doing is compiler is finding out, well, these are the parallel instructions. So if I draw a figure here, So what they call is that these are issue slots, okay? Suppose you have a 4 issue pipeline. So that means you can execute 4 instructions in parallel. The question is, how do I find 4 instructions in parallel, which I can execute in parallel always, okay? Now, this can either be done by the processor or this can be done by the compiler. If it can be done by a processor, then it's a superscalar processor because it's issuing multiple instructions at every fetch, okay? And if it is done by the compiler, then you have this VLIW, that means very long instruction word. You can understand why this is a very long instruction word, because it will be always, what is the compiler doing? Compiler is figuring out which are the instructions which can go in parallel, and it is creating large instructions like this. So it's very large, instruction word parallel. Now, then the question is, for superscalar processors, how do I figure out the parallelism? Well, again, the compiler can do it or the hardware can do it. So if the hardware does, it's dynamically scheduled, and if the compiler does, then it's statically scheduled. Now, of course, this is a good question, that then fundamentally VLIW and statically scheduled becomes very near to each other, right? But the difference would be, in VLIW, you are kind of forcing the compiler that you issue a fixed number of instructions, because you are making the changes at the instruction set level itself. So you are forcing that, well, this is your size of instruction. But here you are not really doing that. All you are doing is you are issuing what we call as not a fixed number of instructions per clock, but it depends on how much you can really do, okay? So here you are kind of forcing it, and here you are not forcing, you are leaving it up to the instruction. Well, then the question comes that, well, then why, can VLIW really work? Because can I always figure out a set of 4 instructions which I can execute in parallel? What will happen in VLIW is, if it cannot figure out, it will leave those issue slots as empty, right? And that will create a redundancy. So in general, this idea is something that people do not go forward with, okay? This is something that people don't do. What people do is, people use VLIWs in certain contexts of programs. For example, all DSP processors, digital signal processing processors, they are all of this type, because they are very regular programs, and you can always figure out what 4 parallel instructions to be issued in parallel, and it can be readily done by a compiler, okay? So with the kind of statically scheduled superscalar, it doesn't really make good sense, because if you are allowing for a fixed number of instructions, a varied number of instructions, then it is kind of neither here nor there. It is not very much a runtime technique. Why will I prefer dynamically scheduled? Because it's a runtime technique. Because at the runtime, I can actually understand more about dependencies rather than at compile time. Am I clear what I just said? Hello?
Yes, sir.
If you are compiling a program, that means what? If you are compiling a program, you are trying to figure out who is depending on whom. But observe something, when you compile a program, you don't know the inputs of the program. What is the problem if you don't know the input of the program? That means which path the program will take. A program has an if and else. Whether the program will execute the if or the else, you don't know, right? So really you don't know which are the instructions which will finally execute with what values and what is the actual dependency. You know some dependencies, but you don't know all of them. If you take the decisions dynamically, then you know the inputs, you know which are the blocks you are actually going to execute. So you can actually juice out a lot of information there. That is why this is what has finally prevailed. The statically scheduled superscalar is, as I said, neither here nor there, because you are doing it at the compile time, you are not doing it at the runtime. But if you are really doing it at the compile time, then it doesn't really make sense to have this kind of varying number of instructions. Why? Because then your instruction lengths keep on changing, right? And if you have instruction lengths keep on changing, then unfortunately you have always budgeted that instruction will be of the maximum issue length. You have got a lot of hardware to address that in the processor, but you are not always able to fill the processor properly. Am I making the point? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
So that's why I said it's kind of neither here nor there. You are not really exploiting the full advantage of the processor, or neither you are exploiting the full advantage of the compiler. Okay.
Okay.
Fine. Then comes the next lecture slide. So have you gone through this lecture slide? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So tell me if you have any issues in any part. So what we have given is that a very high level view of the GPU architecture, what are the contents there, and one thing I will be clear, we have given some information on how the older GPUs used to be there, pixel shaders and all that, but that is just for information. We will not have questions on those things on that part, but rather we will be focusing more on the compute GPUs. Yes, please. Somebody had a question, it seems.
Sir, could you please explain the difference between SIMT and SIMD instructions?
Yes, sure. 1 minute. SIMD versus SIMT. Well, any other query?
Sir, like I have doubt in the shader parts, like the components.
Okay. Which part? I mean, what is your doubt?
So like in the GPU pipeline, like you have shown like there are 3 types of shader, and like what they do actually I have not understanding.
I
In
mean,
the above.
yeah, for our purpose you can leave it because I just have it for information. I mean, so essentially what does a shader do? If you are, I mean, because for explaining that it will also require some knowledge of computer graphics, because in gist we can say that any computer graphics function requires multiple different kinds of operations to be done. For example, one is a triangulation kind of operation. Another is for computing the value of a vertex. You have some math operations. So you have pixel shaders, you have rasterizers, and all these different kinds of units, right? Now, earlier GPUs used to have different these kind of units all as dedicated functions. The basic idea behind GPUs was to create a general compute unit which can do all these things, but it was still specific to graphical computing. And then people found that, well, this is good, I can write nice gaming engines using them, and that was one of the reasons why GPUs slowly became powerful. And then people slowly recognized that, well, this is like a general accelerator, I can write general parallel programs on them, and that works nice, and that can accelerate a lot of workloads. So it became about general purpose programming on GPUs. So I mean, this part I can take this offline, we can discuss with you, but this part on the graphics is kind of historical. That's why we have put in the slide. It's not required really for our purpose. I mean, what is your specific doubt? Can you tell me what are the different shaders and how they work? Those things you want to know?
No, like this was like the doubt, like why we need shaders and all these things.
Oh, you need shaders because think that you have a complex computer graphics to render. Okay. So if you have to do that.
So basically the GPU started like the GPU came to existence like because we need something to paint the screen like for the graphics.
Exactly. You have to paint the screen, and not only paint the screen, before painting the screen there are certain kind of specific operations, like you have to compute the location of the vertex, which location are you going to paint. You have to create a geometry, like that painting is also not very kind of rudimentary, right? Let's understand, suppose I have to create a hexagon. I have to render a hexagon on the screen. So how do I really do it? Shall I figure out, well, these are the locations of all those pixels, and I am going to, these are the individual locations of all those pixels, and I am going to turn them red and blue? Not like that, right? We are smart people. So I know that, well, this is a regular convex polygon. So if these are the corner points, then I can connect them. and then what is the side of which corner point I can figure out, and then I can have a sweep or that kind of a geometric command through which I can make an uniform sweep in that area and paint all of them. I am not making you understand this, but the point I am trying to tell is, let just try and appreciate that painting the screen for rendering regular graphics involves lot of math operations, right? Because I will like to know whether this point is in this side of the line or the other side of the line, right?
Yes. Yeah.
If these are the points that are going to take this color, are these points also going to take, are they also inside that convex polygon? So the point is, it requires significant amount of math operations because we are not unsmart, right? We would like to paint the screen in the most efficient way possible, because whatever we are going to render there are going to be more or less like regular geometric shapes. That is why for that there are specific programs known as shader programs or shader hardwares which are present in graphics pipelines of a typical system. I mean, they are responsible for shading the vertex, creating a geometry, and finally shading the pixels, and then doing something called raster operation, which is going to give the final outputs. Okay, but earlier systems, what they happen to have is this kind of a graphics pipeline. That means we'll have this kind of individual fixed function units, and this pipeline will work. Now, this pipeline doesn't mean like a computer architecture pipeline. So these are hardware units through which the paint coordinates will pass and all that. So early GPUs, what they did, they came as general purpose units who can do all this in a programmable fashion. Okay, and then they evolved into general compute platforms.
Sir, in the vector processors, that slide, you had mentioned that if the clock rate is halved, then doubling the number of lanes will retain the same performance. So,
yes.
So how can you explain this? How do we halve the clock rate? So that.
What is the meaning of halving the clock rate?
So how do we halve the clock rate? So how will this take place?
I mean, how do I halve the clock rate?
Right. So what kind of optimization is applied in this vector processor so that the clock rate is halved?
I mean, the optimization simply means adding more resources. It's very simple. So let's say this is, look at the single lane picture. Suppose yes. I want to add these two vectors in, let's say, 10 milliseconds. What is the clock rate I require? 1 clock per millisecond, right?
Right.
Because there are 9 elements. So let's say there is 9 milliseconds. So I require 1 clock per millisecond, right? But suppose my system doesn't want to have, I mean, it is not possible for me to get that fast a clock. So what will I do? I will rather have a much slower clock, which will activate all these units in parallel and process this much like that.
Right.
So the issue is not really that you are halving the clock rate. The issue is you are not able to make the clock any fast. So computer frequencies have hit a scale. I mean, I cannot cross that anymore. So, but even let's say right now I have a 4 gigahertz clock, and it is not possible for me to clock a semiconductor device at more than 4 gigahertz. So what will I do? I will stay at 4 gigahertz and add more units in parallel. So that is what will give me a vector processor. I have more parallel units. So the input vectors will be broken down, distributed among these units, and they will be processed fast. So although my clock is slow, but since I have parallel units, so I get more computation done inside just 1 or 2 clock cycles. So my throughput is high.
Right. Yes. So the clock rate is same, right? Not half, right? It is just for an example.
No. I'm try and understand. Clock rate halved is not the issue at all. The issue is that since I am not able to increase the clock rate, but still I do want our operation to be done fast, the option is that I increase the number of units I have.
Yes, sir.
Right. Yes, clock rate is not half. That is true. Yeah. Okay,
Sir,
any
one
other? Yes.
sir, one other thing. So if we have a single ALU, then the vectorization only helps because we already have machinery which tells us how many iterations of the same calculation to do. Other than that, if we do not like if we do not have we have single lane vector processor, then it would almost be same as a scalar processor.
Right, right, absolutely. So
Okay.
I mean, having a vector processor means you must have more number of parallel units. Otherwise, there you cannot process the vectors in parallel.
Yes, sir.
I mean, the execution will become serialized. Okay, I have still one question with me: SIMD versus SIMT. Any other question? So have
Can
you
you also
understood?
explain your analogy that one SIMT thread is like an SIMD? That analogy. Can you explain
Yes,
that?
yes, we'll come there. Before that, anything else? That is at the last, so I am just asking for related questions. So to understand that, do you all understand what is a warp, like we have defined here?
Yes, 32 threads.
Okay. So everybody understands what is a streaming multiprocessor, what is a scalar processor, what are special function units, and all those things, right? So that's the typical GPU picture that we had here, right? So in a GPU, we are saying there are a lot of processors sitting together, right? So you have what we called as thread processing clusters. Inside them, you have streaming multiprocessors. Inside a streaming multiprocessor, you have scalar processors. Each scalar processor will have some amount of registers with them. Like there is a big register file. Some of the registers will be dedicated to scalar processors. And then you have you have a unified shared memory for each of these streaming multiprocessors. And you have the global memory, which is the system memory, right? The GPU DRAM. Now, let's understand how things happen here. So what is a SIMD, or single instruction multiple data? It means like a vector instruction. Like for example, instead of add, you can have add.v. So you are adding two vectors in parallel, right? Everybody understood what is an SIMD instruction from the previous slides?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Now what we are saying is, think that in a programming language, every instruction is an SIMD instruction. You do not have anything that is a single add. You have add.v, subtract.v, like that. Everything is an SIMD instruction. That means whatever you have to do 32 of the same operations together. So then what happens? In a normal program, I can have sequential threads. I mean executing one instruction, two instruction, three instruction, like that. Or I can also have SIMD instructions, because somehow I found that, well, these are the two vectors I have to work on. For that, I emitted an SIMD instruction. Now we are saying that, well, there is no single thread. For all operations, I mean, what we do is we pack multiple threads who are going to do the same thing at the same time together, and give them those sequence of SIMD instructions. Am I clear what I am saying? Let's understand. I am not executing, two kinds of instructions, that I have vector instruction and scalar instruction. I am saying that I always execute vector instructions. Okay? So what would that really mean?
You are always working on a bunch of data together.
Yeah, I am always working on a bunch of data, and that data, each data belongs to separate threads. So let me take an example. So let's say I have to add certain values, then I have to subtract certain values, and then I have to, let's say, multiply certain values. Okay, and I have to do this on an array of size 1 to 100, or let's say 1 to 64. Now, what is the characteristics of the program? The characteristics is we are saying that all these operations are going to happen on the same input data space. Okay. So essentially we are saying at the input I have an array of 1 to 64 size, right? I have to add, then I have to subtract, and then I have to multiply. This is what I am saying. And at the output I will again get an output array of size 1 to 64, right? So now you see now you understand. I mean, how will I do it? I can do it by a sequence of vector instructions. Add.v, sub.v, mul.v, and finally I will get the output array. So for this kind of parallel programs, I can say that, well, I have a single instruction, and that instruction is at the same time working on different parallel processing threads. So what I will do here is I am launching many parallel threads here. So I launch 64 threads here, call them T1 thread, T2 thread, like this up to T64. Okay. So I have 64 threads. All the threads have to execute the same program, and the program is this: add followed by sub followed by multiply. Okay. So you have single instruction working on multiple threads. Now what is the difference then between single instruction multiple data and single instruction multiple thread? If I have one isolated operation add.v, right, working on a vector, so there is a SIMD instruction, one instruction or working on multiple data points in parallel. But here it is not so. We are executing one instruction on a vector of data at the input, but that is giving me some output on which again I will execute another instruction. So what we are saying is, don't look at this picture in this way in a horizontal fashion, because a vector instruction means you look at it in a horizontal fashion. We are saying that no, you don't do that. What you do instead is you look at it in a vertical fashion. Let's understand what I really mean by this vertical fashion. Give me a minute. So we just say that think that you have one execution thread and you have more such execution threads. So you are launching. I hope everybody has an intuitive concept of what is the thread, right?
Yes.
Ideally, in our standard programming idea, it means one thread is one sequence of instructions to execute. Another thread can be maybe another sequence of threads to execute. Let us say in Java and all those things. I'm not talking about OS threads, by the way, right? So that's what we technically mean. Here we are saying that let's make a special case. We say that, well, for doing this operation that we just defined, I will launch 64 threads. But each thread will have the exactly same sequence of instructions to execute. Now, what is the good thing about that? Then I can make them execute in a nice way, organized way, using vector instructions. So this is why it's basically about single instruction on multiple threads. First add works on all the threads, then sub works on all the threads, then mul works on all the threads, like that. But the question is, do they really work in parallel on all the threads? I mean, suppose I define 1 million threads. Will I add 1 million values in parallel? I cannot do that, right? I do not have the hardware support. So inside one streaming multiprocessor, let's say I have 32 adders. So that means I can only do 32 additions in parallel. So then what I will do is I have to define a unit of computation called warp. Like how many threads will execute in lockstep the same instruction. So that is what we call as warp. And that is the basic unit of GPU computing. This will again come back to this. I mean, this is just an introduction. We'll come back to this after we introduce the CUDA programming model in the next week. Okay. So I hope the basic idea behind SIMD and SIMT should be now clear.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Sir, so here the set of threads is equivalent to a vector, like in SIMD form.
Yeah. Here the idea is every instruction is a vector instruction. Okay. So you just say that, well, I have single instructions, but a single instruction doesn't work on a vector, but it works across threads, on multiple threads together. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Sir, can two different threads be on different branches of the program? And so then how will it run in lockstep?
They will then not run in lockstep. This is known as thread divergence. We'll cover this later on.
Okay.
Here we are just initializing the different concepts of what is a warp and all that. We'll again initialize them using the CUDA programming structures in the next week's classes. Okay. Here we are just trying to tell you what are the different things inside a GPU. So a GPU has a streaming processor, and then you have shared memory inside the streaming processor. You have multiple scalar processors in a shared streaming processor. So these are the things we wanted to tell you here. So look into the video very carefully. I think we have tried to explain all these concepts there. This is just kind of information. So everybody understands what is a shared memory inside a GPU? How does it work?
Yes, sir.
So suppose you have two threads in two different streaming processors. Can they access the same shared memory?
If they're in the same streaming multiprocessor, then yes.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know.
Sir, can you open the memory hierarchy for Fermi GTX 480?
Can you just tell the slide number? This one?
Just a minute.
This one? The Fermi hierarchy?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So in the memory hierarchy, the local memory per thread is also in the external DRAM, right?
Yeah. So there are a few things here. Inside one SM, you have got these SP cores, right? Apart from that, you have a few more things. You have some shared memory inside the SM, right? And you have some part of the shared memory can be configured as an L1 cache. Okay. And you have a register file, which is very big here. And logically speaking, each core will have access to some items in the register file. Like each core will have some set of registers assigned to it in the runtime. But in the parlance of program, for the threads, it will be getting some amount of memory allocated in the DRAM, which will be called as local memory. Now, let's not confuse this with the register file. So let's understand this. So you have the DRAM, right? The DRAM is the global memory. That means everything that one SM or one SP does on the DRAM, updates a variable on the DRAM, it is transparently seen by everybody, every other SM and SP. But that is not about the entire DRAM. There will be some parts of the DRAM which will also be assigned specifically to each of the different SPs for their own usage. Okay. But finally, what will happen? Suppose you have defined a variable, right? Internal variable is defined, and for that there's some local memory is there in the DRAM. After you access it once, if there is some space in the register file, then some of it will also come to the registers through the cache hierarchy, and you will eventually get it in the registers which are assigned to each of the SPs. So what is missing here is you have local memory. So you can think like this. You have the DRAM, right, which is a global memory. But a part of it is also reserved for each of the SPs for its own personal usage. Now let's understand why that will be done. You may think that, well, for each of the SPs, it has got some part of the register file assigned to it, right? This is a big register file, and some part of it goes to this core, some part of it goes to this core, like that. Goes to means that it is kind of the owner of this part, right? Are you getting my point?
Yes.
But now what will happen? Say this code is processing so much of data that register pressure increases. So for that, it will then need extra memory, and that is when that local memory which is assigned to it in the DRAM, that will be of use. So that is reserved for this one only. So the DRAM will have two parts. One is which is reserved for all these cores, and the one which is kind of the actual global memory for everybody. And that becomes useful when you have the register pressure high for each of the cores.
So my doubt is whether this will be slower compared to shared memory access, or this will be faster.
It will be slower, definitely slower compared to the shared memory access. But the thing is, this will come into play only when you are exceeding your part of the register file. Getting my point?
Yes.
If you have enough registers to work with,
register access faster?
That's what we are saying, right? Register access is faster. Then you have shared memory access or L1 cache access, because both are there in the same physical memory, and then you have the global memory access. So that's what we are discussing, that in the global memory a segment is also known as local memory, but you don't use it always. You will use it only when you are not able to store things in the register file. Am I clear here?
Sir, is there a particular reason why this local memory is not allotted in the shared memory level and used in the allotted in the external DRAM? Since shared memory is comparatively faster than the
shared memory has a specific usage. Shared memory is transparently available to everybody. It is not private to a core. Hello?
Yes.
We want memory which is private to a core also. So there are two places where you can have memory private to a core, in the register file and in the global memory. So what you do in the global memory, you keep some part which you just call local. It's not local really, but it's local also in the sense that it is private to that core. But you will only use it where? When you have exceeded your quota of registers in the register file. So let me just summarize properly. You have a set of SPs or scalar processors. Each scalar processor gets a part of this register file for its personal usage. If it exceeds that quota while executing a program, there is high register pressure, then it will look into its quota of local memory in the global memory. What is common to everybody? The global memory part in the DRAM is common to everybody. So whatever update is happening there, every core can see. What is common? What is also common to everybody is the shared memory. So if you have something here in the shared memory, that is you do something here, that is also transparently seen by every core. So every core can go and change things in the shared memory. But is this whole a shared memory? No. In CUDA, you can actually, for certain GPU architectures, you can configure the shared memory, some part as L1 cache and some part as shared memory. What is the difference between L1 cache and shared memory? The part which is shared memory is shared. That means it is transparent to everybody. But the part which is L1 cache is merely acting as a temporary storage between the register file, local memory, and in between it is sitting, right? So if you don't get your thing in the register file, you look into the L1 cache. And if you don't get in there, then you go to the local memory or the global memory, remember, depending on whatever you are looking for. So the local memory is nothing but an extension of the register file, and it is located in the DRAM, so it is very slow. It is as slow as the global memory. Both are located in the DRAM. To make things fast, you need some cache. So between that global memory and the register file, you have the L1 cache. Where is the L1 cache located? The L1 cache and the shared memory are located together in a same memory element here, which is faster than global memory because it is sitting inside the chip here, but it is also slower than register file because it is further away from the register file. So fastest access is every core's quota of register file. If there is a miss there, then it will go to the L1 cache. If there is a miss there, it will go to the local memory or the global memory part, whichever has been referred to. It will go to the local memory if the access is to its own items which the core owns. It will go to the global memory if it is to access to certain things which are transparent to everybody. It will again go here to the shared memory if the data item has been explicitly defined as a shared data type. We will teach all this when we start with CUDA. But what is important is you have to understand this shared memory and the L1 cache, how much of shared memory you want and how much of L1 cache you want, you can configure that. Is that understood?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay.
Sir,
So,
sir, I
yes.
have another question. Sir,
Yes.
is the DRAM that we are talking in GPU architecture the same RAM that is being used by the processor also in the computer?
I mean, they can
are
have
they-
different sizes. The material may be same.
No, no. I mean the RAM, main RAM of the computer is
No. It's not
not
that. It's not that. The GPU card has got a big DRAM of its own. It is not the CPU's RAM.
Okay.
But that is, I am talking about the standard systems in your workstation or laptop. Okay. But if you look into this slide, we have also spoken about several different kinds of CPU, GPU systems where things may be different. So look into all this.
Okay.
In the last few slides, we will see about mobile GPUs and all that, where the architectures are different.
Okay. And sir, when we try to go and buy a GPU from the market, they actually quote some memory for the GPU, like 2 GB graphics card or something like that. What is that 2 GB? It is the size of the DRAM.
The DRAM of the GPU.
Okay.
Okay. Fine. So if there are no more questions, we'll end here and we'll post new lectures and introductory things to CUDA. But keep on pushing your questions in the student discussion forum, which we can handle. And just to ask, like, so this way of conducting, people are okay? I mean, this is working okay, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, then see you next week, same time. And in between, we'll post new lectures and videos on this. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.